What if the first war in history was never fought by humans at all? What if it unfolded before memory learned how to speak clearly, before time itself was arranged into neat lines, leaving only fragments pressed into clay and buried beneath centuries of forgetting? Why do the oldest written records known to humanity begin not with peace or creation, but with tension, rivalry, and quiet descriptions of conflict that never fully resolve? And, before you let your body sink completely into this comfort, take a very small moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if something in what I'm sharing makes you feel like staying a little longer. If you wish, share the place and time where you're listening. I'm always curious about the small points of light drifting together through the night. The earliest tablets do not shout. They do not declare wars or victories in the way later empires would. They whisper instead, through broken lines and repeated phrases, through silences where entire events should have been. In the cities that rose between the Tigris and Euphrates, scribes pressed reeds into wet clay and recorded lists of kings, offerings to unseen powers, hymns that praise order while nervously circling around chaos. Yet threaded through these calm surfaces is something unsettled, a sense that order itself had once been threatened. The tablets speak of gods who argue, who divide territories, who assemble councils not in celebration but in urgency. The language is formal, restrained, almost careful. It is as though the scribes were aware that they were handling something dangerous, something that required distance. These were not bedtime stories for children. They were records shaped to survive. Modern scholarship often labels these passages as myth, a word that comforts by implying distance. But myth, in its oldest sense, was never fiction. It was memory shaped into meaning, and when memory passes through trauma, it rarely remains intact. It fragments, it repeats itself, it avoids direct confrontation with what hurt the most. Across multiple tablets, copied and recopied over centuries, there is a recurring suggestion that the divine order did not always agree with itself. Names change slightly, roles blur, but the pattern remains. A generation of gods gives way to another. Authority shifts. Power is renegotiated. Something is overthrown, or perhaps merely displaced. And yet, the cause is never described in detail. No clear beginning, no final ending. This absence invites a question that lingers longer than any inscription. Why preserve the outcome but obscure the event? Why name the rulers of heaven, but hesitate when recounting how they came to rule? In later traditions, echoes of these same tensions appear again. Greek poets would speak of Titans and Olympians. Norse storytellers would remember Aesir and Vanir. In India, Devas and Asuras clash in cycles without end. Each culture insists on its own uniqueness, yet the underlying structure repeats with unsettling consistency. Older powers challenged, new orders imposed, the world remade, not gently, but through rupture. The Sumerian tablets never describe thunderbolts or flaming skies directly. Instead, they speak of decrees altered, destinies reassigned, cities destroyed not by accident, but by withdrawal of favour. In one version, a god abandons a city, and soon after, the city collapses. The cause appears political, almost bureaucratic, but the effect is total. Some researchers have noted how this framing subtly shifts responsibility. Destruction is not presented as an act of violence, but as a consequence of cosmic disagreement. The war, if it existed, is sanitized. It becomes administrative, a reshuffling of divine jurisdiction. This raises an unsettling possibility. That what we are reading is not the full memory of a conflict, but its aftermath. The version deemed safe enough to pass down. The version that explains why the world is the way it is, without reopening wounds that might destabilize the fragile order rebuilt afterward. Clay tablets are resilient, but knowledge is not. Libraries burn, languages drift. Scribes copy what they are permitted to copy. Over time, gaps widen, the missing lines become as meaningful as the surviving ones. And in those gaps, imagination rushes in, not to invent, but to wonder. What if the first war of the gods was not erased by accident? What if it was softened deliberately, reshaped into something symbolic so that later generations could live without fear of repeating it? What if humanity inherited not the story of that war, but its silence? Even now, as scholars debate whether these accounts represent celestial beings, personified natural forces, or encoded social upheavals, the tablets remain unmoved. They do not clarify. They do not correct. They simply endure, waiting for each era to ask its own questions of them, and perhaps that is their true function. Not to explain what happened, but to ensure that something unresolved continues to echo. A reminder pressed into clay that order once broke, that authority was contested, and that history, even at its very beginning, may already be a rewritten draft. If that is the case, then the first war was not only a battle among gods, it was the first act of forgetting. The unease left behind by the first fragments does not settle. It lingers, quietly demanding attention, as if the silence itself were the next clue. When scholars examine the tablets more closely, not for what they say, but for how they were made, another layer of uncertainty begins to surface. These texts were not spontaneous confessions from a distant past. They were products of institutions, of schools, of trained scribes working within strict traditions. Every line was learned, copied, corrected, and approved. Memory here was never free. Clay tablets feel ancient and immutable, yet they are surprisingly fragile witnesses. A tablet rarely survives alone. What we read today is often the result of dozens of copies produced centuries apart. Each generation of scribes inherited not only the words, but the authority to shape them. Variations appear, a title changes, a name is replaced with a more familiar one, a passage grows shorter or disappears entirely. None of these changes announce themselves. They slip in quietly, justified as clarification, simplification, or correction. Within this process, the stories of divine conflict become increasingly abstract. Early versions hint at tension through action, gods convening, decisions made under pressure, territories reassigned. Later copies soften these movements into fixed hierarchies. The conflict fades, leaving structure behind. It is as though the scribes were smoothing a rough surface, sanding away the sharp edges of an event no longer meant to be felt. This pattern raises a difficult question. Were the tablets preserving memory or managing it? In Mesopotamian culture, writing was never neutral. It was power. To inscribe something was to grant it legitimacy, to anchor it within cosmic order. Kings understood this. Priests understood it even more. What was written defined what was real, what was sanctioned, what could be remembered without consequence. What remained unwritten, or was allowed to decay, slipped into the realm of danger. When a tablet breaks, the break is not random. The missing section often falls where narrative intensity should peak. Lines that might explain cause are gone, while lines describing outcome remain. We are told that a god lost authority, but not why. That a city was abandoned, but not what provoked the departure. The pattern repeats too often to feel accidental. Some Assyriologists have noted that certain tablets appear deliberately summarized, as though they were already abridged when copied. They read like conclusions without premises. This is particularly striking in texts dealing with divine succession. We are informed that a younger generation now rules, that destinies have been reassigned, that cosmic balance has been restored. Restoration implies disruption. Yet the disruption itself is never fully present. This absence becomes more pronounced when compared to administrative records from the same periods. Trade logs, legal disputes, land transfers, these are recorded with obsessive precision. Nothing is too small to note. Penalties are specified. Witnesses are named. Consequences are traced. Only when the subject turns to the gods does clarity dissolve into vagueness. It is tempting to explain this as reverence. Perhaps the scribes feared to describe divine violence too directly. Perhaps the sacred demanded restraint. But restraint alone does not explain repetition, nor does it explain why similar patterns of omission appear across regions and centuries. Another possibility suggests itself, quietly and uncomfortably, that the scribes were not simply recording tradition, but inheriting a version of it already filtered, that by the time writing began, the war, if war it was, had already been processed, reframed, and contained. The tablets would then be not eyewitness accounts, but echoes of echoes, each one further removed from the original rupture. This would explain the strange tone that permeates these texts. They are solemn, but not mournful, authoritative, but not triumphant. They speak as though something irreversible has occurred, and everyone involved has agreed not to discuss it openly. The world continues, rituals resume, offerings are made. Yet beneath this normality runs a quiet tension, as if order itself were provisional. When later civilizations encountered these tablets, they inherited not only the stories, but the silences. Translators worked with what survived. They reconstructed myths from fragments, unaware that those fragments may have been curated long before they were buried. In this way, modern understanding may be shaped by ancient editorial decisions we can no longer see. And so the mystery deepens. If the first war of the gods was already distant by the time it was written down, then its true shape may never have been meant to endure. What we possess is not history, but a controlled memory, stable enough to support civilization, vague enough to prevent destabilizing questions. Yet questions persist anyway. They surface whenever patterns repeat too precisely to be coincidence, whenever cultures separated by oceans remember similar struggles in the heavens, whenever authority feels less like a gift and more like the outcome of negotiation. Perhaps the tablets were never intended to tell us what happened. Perhaps they were meant to show us how forgetting begins, not through erasure, but through careful preservation of only what can be safely remembered. And if that is true, then every missing line is not a loss, but a warning, a reminder that knowledge can be shaped not only by destruction, but by protection, by the quiet decision to look away at the most critical moment. The clay waits patiently, it always has, and as long as it endures, so too will the unease that something essential was left unsaid. The silence surrounding the conflict does not remain empty for long. It begins to take shape through patterns, subtle at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore. Across multiple traditions preserved on clay, there emerges a quiet architecture of division. Not chaos, not annihilation, but separation. Domains are assigned, boundaries are drawn. Authority is distributed with a carefulness that suggests it was once contested. In the tablets, the divine world is never a single unified will. It is layered, stratified, tense. Councils are convened not to celebrate harmony, but to deliberate. Decisions are made collectively. Yet the tone implies urgency rather than ritual. Something has forced these assemblies into existence. Something has disrupted an earlier equilibrium. The language used to describe these moments is revealing. Words associated with decree and destiny appear repeatedly, as though fate itself required renegotiation. To decree is not to create from nothing. It is to alter an existing arrangement. Destiny in these texts feels less like a cosmic constant and more like a legal document, revised, reassigned, enforced. This legalistic tone is striking. Conflict is not narrated through violence, but through governance. Power shifts are framed as administrative necessity. A god loses authority not because they are defeated, but because their mandate ends. Another rises not through conquest, but through appointment. Yet beneath this civility lies the unmistakable implication that something forced these changes to occur. When the tablets describe the older order, they do so obliquely. There is no golden age, no extended praise. The past is acknowledged, then quickly moved beyond. Attention is redirected toward stability, toward the present arrangement, toward obedience. This avoidance feels deliberate, as though too much reflection on what came before might undermine what exists now. Some scholars have suggested that these divisions mirror political realities of early city-states, projecting human hierarchies onto the heavens. But this explanation falters when confronted with the consistency of the pattern across cultures that developed independently. The same structure appears again and again: an older generation, a challenge, a reorganization, and a new order that insists on permanence while quietly acknowledging fragility. The gods themselves are not portrayed as omniscient or infallible. They debate, they hesitate, they react. This alone sets these accounts apart from later theological systems that demand absolute authority. Here, authority appears earned, or taken, through circumstances that are never fully explained. One recurring motif is the confinement or distancing of certain divine figures. They are not destroyed, they are relocated, assigned to the edges of the cosmos, to the depths of water, to the margins of relevance. Exile without erasure, memory without prominence. This is not the language of mythic fantasy, it is the language of political compromise. Such compromises leave traces. The world, as described afterward, feels narrower, more regulated. Rituals become essential. Proper behaviour is emphasized. The gods demand regular offerings, strict observance, unwavering loyalty. This insistence hints at insecurity, as though the new order requires constant reinforcement to prevent regression. In this light, the First War begins to resemble not a battle of annihilation, but a struggle over structure, over who defines reality, over whose voice determines the flow of time, the rhythm of seasons, the fate of cities. Violence, if it occurred, has already been translated into policy by the time it reaches us. This translation is itself a form of concealment. By turning conflict into order, the emotional residue is drained away. Fear becomes law. Trauma becomes tradition. And the memory of rupture is absorbed into the daily fabric of existence, no longer visible as an event but felt as obligation. What remains unsettling is the insistence that this order is final. The tablets repeat this assurance with unusual frequency. The cosmos is now stable. The gods are now aligned. Destiny is now fixed. Such repetition often signals anxiety rather than certainty. It suggests an awareness that stability was achieved at a cost, and that cost must not be examined too closely. The absence of detail surrounding the transition only sharpens this sense. We are told what the world became, but not what it lost. We inherit the aftermath without the story, and in doing so, we are placed in the same position as those ancient scribes, caretakers of a system whose origins we are not encouraged to question. Yet questioning persists. It arises whenever patterns feel too deliberate, whenever silence feels structured rather than accidental. If the first war of the gods reshaped reality itself, then its greatest legacy may not be destruction, but discipline. A cosmos arranged to function, to endure, and above all to forget the conditions that made such arrangement necessary. And if forgetting was essential to survival, then one is left to wonder what might happen if memory were to resurface now. Not as revelation, but as recognition. Not as certainty, but as the quiet realization that order has a history, and that history begins with something unresolved. As the structure of divine authority settles into place, another disturbance becomes visible, not within a single tradition, but across many that never shared borders or languages. The same shape appears again and again, separated by geography yet aligned in form, as though an old memory had travelled farther than any people ever could. Different names are used, different landscapes are imagined, but the story beneath them moves with familiar steps. In Greece, poets speak of titans and Olympians, of an older generation pushed aside by a younger one that claims balance and justice. In the north, The Asir and Vanir clash, then agree to coexist, exchanging hostages as if sealing a treaty rather than ending a war. In ancient India, Devas and Asuras contend endlessly, neither side fully erased, their struggles cycling through epochs of creation and collapse. These are not isolated inventions, they are variations tuned to local cultures, yet strangely consistent in their underlying logic. What binds these stories together is not spectacle, but restraint. The wars of the gods are rarely described in full, they are remembered through outcomes, thrones changed, realms divided, cosmic rules rewritten. The violence itself is compressed into symbol and metaphor. Thunder replaces weaponry, flood replaces siege. Fire becomes purification rather than destruction. Each tradition seems to circle around the same wound without touching it directly. Comparative mythologists have long noted these parallels, often attributing them to shared human psychology or archetypal storytelling. But archetypes do not explain synchronization. They do not account for why similar power struggles appear at roughly the same developmental stages of unrelated civilizations. Nor do they explain why the same narrative gaps appear in each case, as though something essential was omitted everywhere at once. When cultures remember different versions of the same silence, it raises an unsettling possibility. That the silence predates them, that it belongs not to one people, but to a shared inheritance older than language families themselves. An inheritance that survived not through precision, but through pattern. In many of these traditions, the older powers are not portrayed as evil. They are described as excessive, chaotic, or out of alignment with the emerging world. Their removal is framed as necessity rather than justice. This moral ambiguity is important. It suggests that the conflict was not about good and evil, but about compatibility, about which form of authority could sustain the world that was coming into being. This framing echoes the Mesopotamian tablets, where divine succession is treated as administrative correction rather than moral victory. Across cultures, the new order insists it is more stable, more balanced, more suited to the needs of humanity. Yet this insistence itself feels defensive, as though responding to an unspoken accusation. What accusation could that be? Perhaps that the new order was built upon suppression rather than harmony. That something powerful was not destroyed, but contained. That the world we inherited is not the result of triumph, but of compromise enforced by necessity. The repetition of these myths across continents may point to a time when humanity, still young and scattered, encountered the same overwhelming event or the same overwhelming absence, a moment when the structure of reality itself seemed to fracture, and different cultures preserved that fracture in the only way available to them, through story, stripped of detail, insulated by symbolism. If so, then the gods of these myths may not be individuals at all, but representations of forces, intelligences, or systems that once competed for influence over the world. Their wars would then be less about combat and more about control, about which logic would govern time, nature, and human destiny. This interpretation remains controversial, and rightly so. It threatens the boundary between myth and history, a boundary many prefer to keep intact. Yet boundaries, like hierarchies, are often drawn after disruption, not before it. They are tools of stabilization. The fact that so many cultures insist their current cosmic order emerged from conflict suggests a shared intuition. That order is not original, that it is constructed. That beneath the rituals and rules lies a memory of instability that must not be reawakened. Even the endings of these myths refuse closure. The Titans remain imprisoned, not destroyed. The Vanir are absorbed, not erased. The Asuras return again and again. The war never truly ends. It simply changes form, receding into the background of existence, shaping it quietly from within. This persistence hints that the first war was not resolved, only deferred. its tensions redistributed rather than eliminated, and humanity, living within the aftermath, became both witness and participant without ever fully understanding the terms. If the tablets of Mesopotamia offer the earliest written echo of this conflict, then the myths that follow are its reverberations, softened by distance yet unmistakable in rhythm. Together they form a chorus of partial memories, each culture singing the same melody in a different key. The question that emerges is not whether these wars happened as described, it is whether they happened at all, and if they did, whether their true nature was ever meant to be known. Perhaps the gods fought not in the heavens, but in the foundations of reality itself. Perhaps what shattered was not a pantheon, but a way of being that could no longer persist. And if that is the case, then the myths are not exaggerations, they are compressions, attempts to hold something too vast, too destabilizing, within the fragile vessel of narrative. What remains is not an answer, but a pattern that refuses to fade. A reminder that the world, as stable as it appears, may rest upon an agreement forged in silence. An agreement whose origins were buried not to deceive, but to protect. Whether that protection still holds is another question entirely. As the echoes of divine conflict spread across cultures, another layer quietly reveals itself, not through story, but through language itself. Words, after all, remember long after images fade. They carry traces of earlier meanings sedimented through centuries of use. And when those words are examined closely, especially the ones associated with power, destruction, and the sky, an unexpected convergence begins to appear. In the earliest Mesopotamian texts, terms translated as heaven, storm, or radiance often overlap with words denoting authority and force. The sky is not merely above, it governs. To speak of the heavens is to speak of command. The same ambiguity appears elsewhere. In ancient Indo-European languages, roots connected to brightness also imply rule. Light is not passive, it dominates, it orders, it overwhelms. This linguistic fusion suggests that what later cultures separated into metaphor and reality may once have been perceived as the same phenomenon. A storm was not symbolic of power, it was power. A voice from the sky was not poetic imagination, it was authority expressed in its most overwhelming form. Across different civilizations, words associated with divine weapons often blur into descriptions of natural catastrophe. Thunder is both sound and strike. Fire is both element and judgment. Floods cleanse, but they also erase. The language never fully commits to one interpretation, as though unwilling to draw a line that did not exist for those who first used it. Symbolism, too, repeats with unsettling precision. The image of a mountain as the seat of divine authority appears again and again, even in regions where no such mountains dominate the landscape. The mountain becomes less a place and more a concept. Elevation, separation, proximity to the sky. To ascend is to approach power. To fall is to be cast out. Serpents and dragons emerge as recurrent figures in these narratives, often associated with the older order. They are not always malevolent. Sometimes they are guardians, sometimes teachers, sometimes embodiments of chaos. But almost always, they are linked to depth, water, earth, the hidden layers beneath the visible world. Their defeat or confinement signals not moral victory, but a reorientation of balance. The sky asserts dominance over what lies below. In Mesopotamian iconography, the struggle between sky-associated deities and earth or water-associated forces is rarely explicit. Instead, it is encoded through posture, placement, and scale. One figure stands elevated, radiant, controlled. Another coils, recedes, or is partially obscured. The visual language mirrors the textual silence. Conflict is implied, not displayed. Linguists have long noted how words for law and order evolve from terms meaning that which is set in place. Order is not inherent, it is installed. This etymological truth resonates uncomfortably with the mythic narratives that insist order emerge from upheaval. Language seems to remember what story refuses to say outright. Even the word myth itself carries a history of containment. Originally meaning speech or account, it later became a label for what is not taken literally. This shift allowed unsettling narratives to be preserved without being believed. They could be admired, analysed, safely distanced. But the persistence of certain symbols suggests that belief was never the point. Memory was. When similar symbols appear independently, sky gods wielding thunder, earthbound beings associated with older power, cycles of overthrow and containment, it becomes difficult to attribute everything to coincidence or psychological universals. Symbols, like words, are shaped by experience. They respond to what demands expression, even when direct description feels impossible. Some researchers have proposed that these shared symbols reflect encounters with extraordinary natural events, massive storms, meteor impacts, volcanic eruptions. Such events would have been terrifying, transformative, and beyond explanation. Encoding them as conflicts among gods would provide meaning without requiring comprehension. Yet even this explanation does not fully account for the structured hierarchies and negotiated outcomes present in the myths. Natural disasters do not convene councils. They do not redistribute authority. They do not establish long-lasting systems of law and ritual. Those elements suggest something more deliberate, more relational, something that required interpretation, negotiation, and memory management. The persistence of symbolic patterns across millennia implies that whatever inspired them left a deep imprint. Deep enough to shape not only stories but the very words used to describe reality. Language becomes the final witness, carrying traces of an experience too destabilizing to be recalled directly. If the First War of the Gods was remembered through symbol rather than narrative, then these symbols are not decorative. They are compressed history. They allow memory to survive without overwhelming those who inherit it. They whisper where speech would shatter. And so, by following words back to their roots, by tracing symbols across continents and centuries, we begin to sense the outline of something vast and unfinished. Not a single event, but a turning point. Not a battle with winners and losers, but a restructuring of how power, order, and meaning themselves were understood. Language does not accuse. It does not explain. It simply persists, carrying forward the weight of what once demanded expression. And in that persistence, it leaves us with a quiet, enduring unease, a sense that beneath the stories we tell ourselves about beginnings lies another story, spoken only through echoes, waiting for someone to listen closely enough to hear what was never meant to be said aloud. When language and symbol fall silent, the earth itself becomes the next archive, not one that speaks in sentences, but one that remembers through scars, layers, and abrupt transitions. Long before tablets were pressed into clay, the ground beneath human feet was already recording moments of upheaval, moments when continuity fractured and something new was forced to emerge. Geology does not tell stories. It resists narrative. Yet it reveals patterns that unsettle the confidence of linear history. There are periods where change unfolds slowly, almost patiently. And then there are moments where the record jolts, where layers are missing, distorted, or violently rearranged. These moments are not rare. They punctuate Earth's past with uncomfortable regularity. In several regions closely associated with early civilization, evidence points to sudden environmental disruption near the boundary of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. Flood deposits appear where rivers should not have reached. Coastlines retreat abruptly. Ecosystems reorganize themselves in ways that suggest stress rather than gradual adaptation. To modern science, these are data points. To ancient memory, they may have been something else entirely. Flood myths are often dismissed as metaphor or exaggeration, yet their persistence across cultures demands attention. These stories rarely describe a simple overflow of water. They speak of a world reset, of knowledge lost, of lineages broken. Survival itself becomes conditional, granted to a few who carry fragments of the old world into the new. The gods in these narratives are not distant observers, they are agents of decision. What is striking is how often these catastrophic moments align, in mythic memory, with changes in divine hierarchy. A god withdraws, another ascends, a covenant is rewritten, the earth changes, and so does the structure of authority that governs it. Whether these correlations reflect causation or coincidence remains debated, but the pattern persists too consistently to ignore. Some researchers have proposed that rapid climate shifts could have destabilized early societies to such an extent that their belief systems were forced to adapt. Gods associated with abundance may have lost favor, storm or sky deities may have gained prominence, yet this explanation feels incomplete. It accounts for religious change, but not for the peculiar way these changes are remembered, as conflicts rather than transitions. Conflict implies resistance. It implies opposing forces. In mythic terms, this resistance is often embodied by older gods who refuse to yield, who must be subdued, contained, or exiled. In geological terms, resistance appears as inertia, the Earth's tendency to preserve its previous state until overwhelmed by sufficient force. The younger Dryas, a sudden return to near glacial conditions after a period of warming, remains one of the most debated episodes in Earth's recent past. Its onset appears abrupt, its cause remains contested. Its effects would have been devastating to human populations already experimenting with settled life. To those who lived through it, such an event would not have felt natural. It would have felt imposed. If memory of this imposition survived, it may have done so not as data, but as narrative. The sky turns hostile, order collapses, the gods are no longer aligned. Something breaks and must be repaired under new terms. This framing transforms environmental catastrophe into cosmic dispute, making it intelligible, if not controllable. The Earth's own silence mirrors that of the tablets. Layers disappear where continuity is expected. Transitions are sharp, but explanations are absent. Scientists infer causes through models and probabilities. Ancient peoples inferred meaning through story. Neither approach fully resolves the discomfort of the unknown. What complicates matters further is the suggestion that some geological disruptions coincide with increased meteoritic activity. Impacts need not be global to be transformative. Even regional events could have reshaped climate, coastlines, and human survival strategies. A fireball in the sky would not be remembered as a rock. It would be remembered as a god. Such events would blur the boundary between natural and divine beyond recognition. The sky would become both source and weapon. Authority would no longer feel abstract. It would arrive with light, sound, and irreversible consequence. In this context, the language of war becomes not metaphorical but inevitable. Yet even here the memory remains cautious. The myths do not dwell on impact. They dwell on aftermath, on the establishment of new rules, on the necessity of obedience, on the dangers of provoking forces beyond comprehension. Fear becomes ritualized. Survival becomes conditional upon alignment with the new order. This conditional survival echoes through the tablets and myths alike. Humanity is spared, but diminished. Knowledge is retained, but fragmented. The world continues, but under stricter terms. It is the language of concession, not victory. If the first war of the gods coincided with a period when the earth itself seemed to turn against its inhabitants, then the decision to encode that memory indirectly becomes understandable. To remember too clearly would be to live perpetually in terror. To forget entirely would be to risk repetition. Symbol and silence offer a middle path. The earth, like the tablets, preserves only what can endure pressure. What fractures is lost. What compresses survives. and so we inherit a past shaped not only by events, but by the limits of what could be remembered without breaking those who remembered it. The ground beneath us is stable now, or appears to be. The sky is predictable, or mostly so, but stability, like order, has a history. And that history may begin with a moment when the world itself seemed to choose sides. Whether that choice was random, natural, or something else entirely remains unresolved. The Earth does not answer questions. It only waits, holding its layers together while we decide how deeply we are willing to listen to what they imply. After catastrophe, memory rarely returns intact. It reorganizes itself around survival. What cannot be integrated is set aside, not erased, but sealed behind ritual, taboo, and abstraction. This is where the idea of a restart quietly enters the narrative, not as an invention of modern speculation, but as a recurring intuition embedded within ancient thought. Many early traditions speak not of a single beginning, but of cycles, ages that rise, collapse, and give way to something altered. The language is never triumphant. It is cautious, even weary. The world resumes, but it does not reset to innocence. It resumes under conditions. Limits are imposed, lifespans shorten, knowledge becomes restricted, the cosmos tightens its grip. In Mesopotamian sources, the kingship is said to descend from the heavens after a great disruption. This descent is not described as a gift freely given, but as a transfer. Authority is relocated, governance is delegated. The divine steps back, and humanity is left to administer a world that feels newly constrained. This transition is presented as order restored, yet the tone suggests loss rather than celebration. What was lost is never named directly. Instead, the texts emphasize what remains: cities, laws, calendars, agriculture. These are framed as compensations, tools for stability in a world that can no longer sustain whatever came before. Civilization itself begins to feel like an adaptation, not an aspiration. In several traditions, survivors of a great disruption are described as carriers of fragments. Skills remembered imperfectly, stories repeated without full understanding, sacred objects whose original purpose has faded. This fragmentation of knowledge mirrors the fragmentation of the tablets themselves. Continuity exists, but it is compromised. The notion of a reset does not require annihilation. It requires reconfiguration, a narrowing of possibility, a reduction of complexity to something manageable. In this sense, a reset is not an ending but a concession. The world continues but at a lower threshold. Some researchers have suggested that such narratives reflect real demographic bottlenecks, moments when human populations were drastically reduced. These events would not only affect survival, but memory itself. Entire ways of life could vanish, leaving descendants with no reference point for what was lost. In such cases, myth becomes the only vessel capable of carrying absence forward. What complicates this interpretation is the moral framing. The reset is rarely portrayed as accidental. It is justified. The old world is described as unstable, excessive, or out of alignment. The reset becomes necessary, even merciful. This moralization hints at agency. Someone, or something, decided that the previous configuration could not continue. In the tablets, this decision is attributed to the gods collectively. Councils deliberate, decrees are issued, fate is adjusted, humanity is spared, but placed under stricter oversight. The language suggests not punishment, but management, as though the world had become too volatile and required tighter control. This idea resonates uncomfortably with modern understandings of systems collapse. When complexity exceeds resilience, systems fail. Recovery often involves simplification. Redundancy is removed. Autonomy is reduced. Stability is prioritized over growth. In mythic terms, this process becomes divine intervention. If the first War of the Gods resulted in a reset, then the war itself may have been less about domination and more about limitation, about deciding what level of power, knowledge, or freedom could be sustained without catastrophic consequence. The conflict would then represent a crisis of scale rather than morality. This reframing casts humanity in a different light, not as the central concern, but as a variable within a larger system. Humanity survives because it adapts, because it accepts the new constraints, because it aligns with the post-reset order. Disobedience in later myths is often punished swiftly. The lesson is clear. Stability is conditional. The persistence of reset narratives across cultures suggests that this intuition did not arise from isolated imagination. It reflects a shared unease about beginnings that feel incomplete, about civilizations that emerge already haunted by the sense that something greater once existed and was lost for reasons never fully explained. This unease surfaces whenever myths emphasize forgetting as much as remembering. When knowledge is described as dangerous, when curiosity is framed as transgression, these themes imply that the reset was not only environmental or social, but cognitive. Certain questions became off-limits, certain memories became inaccessible. The War of the Gods in this light becomes a boundary event, a line drawn across reality, separating what could be known before from what would be allowed afterward. The gods who remain enforce this boundary not through constant violence, but through structure, ritual, and silence. And yet boundaries erode. Over time, fragments resurface, symbols persist, patterns repeat. The memory of reset never disappears entirely. It lingers at the edges of culture, resurfacing whenever stability feels fragile, whenever the world seems to strain against its limits. If this cycle has occurred before, then its traces would not announce themselves clearly. They would appear as déjà vu, as the unsettling sense that history is not progressing but circling, that the questions we ask now were once asked before and perhaps answered in ways we no longer remember. The reset, then, is not merely a past event. It is a condition, a reminder embedded within culture that order is provisional, that complexity has a cost, and that forgetting may sometimes be mistaken for peace. What remains uncertain is whether the reset was the end of the war, or simply its transformation into something quieter, something that no longer needed open conflict, because its outcome had been internalized. And if that is so, then the most enduring legacy of the First War of the Gods may not be the stories we tell, but the limits we rarely question, the boundaries of thought we inherit without noticing, the sense that some truths, even now, feel too heavy to carry fully awake. As the idea of a reset settles into the background of memory, another presence becomes more visible, not as a force of nature, but as an interpreter. Between the silence of the gods and the endurance of humanity, institutions arise. They do not claim authorship of the past. They claim stewardship of meaning. Temples, priesthoods, and later empires step into the space left by withdrawn divinity, offering coherence where memory has fractured. In the earlier cities, authority does not present itself as innovation. It presents itself as continuity. Kings rule by decree, laws are said to be revealed, and rituals are framed as restorations rather than inventions. Power survives by aligning itself with what came before, even when what came before is only partially remembered. The past becomes a resource, carefully rationed. Writing, once rare and sacred, becomes the mechanism through which this rationing occurs. Tablets are archived. Hymns are standardized. Genealogies are fixed. What is recorded gains permanence. What is excluded fades quietly. Over time, the distinction between what never happened and what is no longer permitted to be remembered grows indistinct. This process does not require malice. It requires stability. Societies emerging from disruption cannot afford ambiguity. They need frameworks that explain suffering without reopening it, Institutions provide these frameworks, not by answering every question, but by narrowing the range of acceptable ones. Within temple complexes, knowledge is layered. Certain texts are public, recited, performed. Others are restricted, taught only to initiates. The deeper one goes, the more abstract the language becomes. Direct description gives way to allegory. Concrete memory dissolves into principle. This stratification mirrors the earlier pattern of myth itself. The closer one approaches the core, the less explicit it becomes. The gods in this environment transform. They become guarantors of order rather than participants in conflict. Their earlier rivalries are smoothed into complementary roles. Disagreement becomes balance. War becomes cosmology. What was once unstable is reframed as necessary tension within a harmonious whole. This reframing serves a purpose. It allows societies to function without constant fear of recurrence. If the war of the gods is eternal but contained, then it no longer threatens to return in recognizable form. It becomes background noise, a distant hum that justifies vigilance without demanding panic. Empires adopt this logic eagerly. Expansion is framed as restoration. Conquest becomes reunification. Resistance is labelled chaos. By aligning political authority with cosmic order, dissent becomes sacrilege. Memory is no longer merely curated, it is enforced. Yet enforcement leaves traces. Whenever a narrative becomes too smooth, it invites suspicion. In several traditions, suppressed strands persist at the margins. Heretical texts, alternative genealogies, forbidden names. These fragments often retain sharper edges. They remember conflict where official versions remember harmony. Their very existence suggests that consensus was achieved through pressure, not inevitability. Such pressures intensify with time. As empires grow, their need for coherent origin stories increases. The past must not only explain the present, it must legitimize it. Any memory that threatens this legitimacy becomes dangerous. Silence, once a byproduct of trauma, becomes policy. The war of the gods, under this regime, is not denied. It is transformed into doctrine. It becomes proof that order requires authority, that authority requires hierarchy, and that hierarchy must not be questioned too deeply. The lesson is subtle, but persistent. Stability depends on acceptance. What is rarely acknowledged is the cost of this acceptance. By smoothing memory, institutions also flatten imagination. Possibility narrows. The sense that reality could be otherwise fades. The world becomes fixed, ordained, immune to fundamental change. This rigidity feels safe until it does not. Across history, moments of crisis often coincide with sudden interest in suppressed myths. When systems strain, people look backward, searching for alternative models hidden within the past. The same fragments resurface, carrying whispers of earlier configurations, not as instructions but as reminders that what exists now was not always inevitable. In this way, institutions become both guardians and obstacles. They preserve continuity but at the expense of depth. They protect society from destabilizing knowledge, while simultaneously ensuring that such knowledge never fully disappears. It remains embedded in ritual, symbol, and contradiction. The persistence of these contradictions suggests that the first war of the gods was never fully resolved at the level of meaning. Its outcome was enforced structurally, not integrated psychologically. The result is a civilization that functions, but remains uneasy with its own foundations. Even now, long after the temples have crumbled and the empires have faded, their influence lingers. Modern frameworks of knowledge inherit the same instinct to separate legitimate inquiry from dangerous speculation. Some questions are encouraged, others are quietly discouraged. The language has changed, but the impulse remains. If the first war reshaped reality and the reset constrained what could be remembered, then institutions are the final layer of containment. They ensure that the past remains usable, not truthful, manageable, not complete. Yet containment is never absolute. Gaps remain. Contradictions persist. And in those spaces, curiosity continues to drift, drawn toward the edges of what is permitted to be known. The question that emerges is not whether institutions concealed the war, but whether they inherited a concealment already in motion, whether they are architects of forgetting, or simply its most efficient custodians. And if custodianship was necessary once, during a time when memory itself threatened survival, one is left to wonder whether the same necessity still applies, or whether the world has changed enough to face what was once set aside. For now, the silence holds, not empty, but structured, waiting for the moment when listening becomes less dangerous than forgetting. At a certain depth, the distinction between myth and history begins to feel less like a boundary and more like a convenience. It allows uncomfortable questions to be relocated rather than answered. The deeper one listens to the surviving fragments, the more apparent it becomes that the category itself may be a later invention, applied retroactively to keep incompatible ideas from touching. In the oldest texts, the beings later translated as gods do not behave like abstractions. They deliberate, they disagree, they make errors, adapt to consequences and revise decisions. Their knowledge appears extensive yet incomplete. Their power is formidable yet constrained by circumstance. These are not the qualities of timeless symbols. They are the qualities of agents operating within a system. This observation has unsettled scholars for generations. To take the text too literally risks collapsing myth into misplaced history. To take them too metaphorically risks missing whatever compelled such consistent, disciplined description in the first place. The tension remains unresolved, not because it lacks evidence, but because it resists classification. In Mesopotamian records, the gods possess specialized domains rather than universal authority. One governed storms, another fertility, another knowledge, another the underworld. Authority is distributed, not absolute. Coordination is required. Councils are necessary. Such structures resemble organizations more than embodiments of nature. They imply roles, jurisdictions, and limits. The suggestion that these figures might represent advanced entities rather than metaphysical concepts has long existed at the margins of academic discourse. It is not new. It surfaces periodically, only to be dismissed as anachronistic or speculative. Yet dismissal often arrives without engagement, as though the question itself were the greater threat. What threatens is not the idea of advanced beings, but the implication it carries. If the gods were not merely symbols, then humanity's earliest records may preserve distorted memories of interaction rather than imagination. Interaction implies influence. Influence implies dependency. And dependency complicates the narrative of autonomous human development. Even within orthodox interpretations, the gods are described as teachers. They instruct humans in agriculture, metallurgy, writing, law. These gifts are framed as benevolent, yet they also establish hierarchy. Knowledge flows downward. Gratitude is expected. Disobedience carries consequence. The relationship is asymmetrical. In this framework, the war of the gods takes on another dimension. It becomes not only a struggle among higher powers, but a crisis that redefines humanity's position within the system. After the conflict, the gods withdraw slightly. Humans are left with institutions rather than direct guidance. Responsibility increases. So does vulnerability. This shift is subtle, but profound. It suggests that the war marked a transition from direct oversight to indirect control, from presence to structure, from intervention to regulation. The gods no longer appear openly, but their influence remains embedded in law, ritual, and cosmic order. Such a transition would explain the peculiar tone of later myths, where gods are both omnipresent and distant. They are invoked constantly, yet rarely encountered directly. Their will is known through intermediaries, signs, and inherited tradition. The immediacy of earlier interaction has faded into memory. Whether these beings were external intelligences, internalized projections, or something that does not fit modern categories remains uncertain. What matters is the consistency of the shift. Something changed, and the change was significant enough to redefine how reality itself was understood. The reluctance to explore this possibility may stem from its destabilizing potential. If early history includes non-human agency that shapes civilization, then the story of progress becomes less linear, less self-contained. Humanity becomes a participant rather than the sole author of its destiny. Yet even this framing may be incomplete. The texts do not portray humans as passive. They negotiate, they plead, they resist. They are punished and rewarded, but they are also consulted. This reciprocity suggests a relationship more complex than domination or worship. It suggests collaboration under constraint. The War of the Gods, then, could represent a breakdown in this collaborative system. A moment when higher-level coordination failed, forcing a restructuring that rippled downward. Humanity survived, but the terms of engagement changed. Autonomy increased, but so did isolation. This interpretation does not require abandoning mythic language. It requires listening to it differently, not as fantasy, but as compressed memory filtered through symbolism. Symbols, in this view, are not disguises. They are translations, attempts to render the incomprehensible into forms that can be carried forward without collapse. The persistence of this translation across cultures suggests that something compelled it. Not curiosity alone, but necessity. Direct memory may have been too destabilizing. Indirect memory, shaped into gods and stories, could endure. If so, then the question of whether the gods were real misses the point. The more relevant question becomes why reality required such framing. What conditions made symbolic memory safer than literal recollection? What risks were avoided by allowing the war to dissolve into myth? Perhaps the war involved technologies or capabilities that threatened the continuity of life itself. Perhaps it revealed vulnerabilities that could not be unlearned. Perhaps the safest outcome was not victory, but amnesia. The tablets do not say, they never will. But their careful ambiguity suggests intention rather than ignorance. They offer just enough structure to maintain coherence, just enough silence to prevent destabilization. In this balance, humanity learned to live without full knowledge of its own beginnings, to accept origins that feel incomplete, to inherit a world shaped by decisions made beyond its reach. Whether those decisions were made by gods, systems, or forces yet unnamed matters less than their persistence. The effects remain visible in the way history hesitates, in the way myth refuses to settle into fiction, and in the quiet sense that something foundational remains unresolved. If the first War of the Gods was also the first crisis of meaning, then its legacy is not confusion, but caution. A world taught very early on to be careful with what it remembers. When memory survives only in fragments, absence becomes a form of evidence. What is missing begins to speak as loudly as what remains. In the case of the tablets, the gaps are not random. They cluster around moments where explanation would be most expected, where cause should precede effect, where conflict should be named rather than implied. Some texts reach us only through quotations preserved in later works, references embedded within commentaries written centuries after the originals were lost. These secondary echoes often allude to narratives that no longer exist in full. A scribe mentions an older account. A priest references a forbidden hymn. A myth survives only as a rebuttal to something no longer accessible. In each case, we glimpse the outline of a story that was once present enough to require response. This indirect survival is unsettling. It suggests not only loss, but selection. The texts that endured did so because they were compatible with the systems that followed. Those that did not were allowed to fade, or perhaps encouraged to do so. The result is a historical record shaped less by completeness than by suitability. Among the most intriguing are the so-called problematic passages, sections that resist harmonization with later theology. They describe gods who act impulsively, who express regret, who are surprised by outcomes. These moments are often smoothed over in later copies or explained away by commentators. The discomfort they cause is palpable. A god who learns undermines the idea of omniscience. A god who reacts undermines the idea of control. In some cases, these passages are removed entirely. Their absence is explained as damage, as scribal error, as the natural decay of fragile material. Yet when damage consistently affects the same types of content, coincidence becomes less convincing. What survives seems curated towards stability, not transparency. The fragments that do survive often feel incomplete by design. They end abruptly. They transition without resolution. They hint at events whose details are never supplied. This pattern creates a peculiar reading experience. One senses that the text assumes prior knowledge the reader does not possess, as though the original audience knew what was being referenced and did not require elaboration. This raises the possibility that the earliest audiences of these texts were not us. They were not distant descendants piecing together meaning from ruins. They were contemporaries, or near contemporaries, for whom the context was still alive. The texts did not need to explain everything because much was already understood or deliberately unspoken. Over time, as that shared context faded, the texts remained, but their silences grew heavier. What was once a mission became mystery. What was once discretion became enigma. Modern readers, encountering these gaps, project speculation into them, mistaking absence for invitation. Yet the tone of the tablets does not feel inviting. It feels restrained, careful. As though even now, across millennia, the text resists being pressed too hard. It yields structure but withholds narrative. It offers outcome without confession. The war of the gods, if it existed, may be most clearly visible in what could not be preserved. The violence that could not be ritualized. The decisions that could not be justified. The consequences that could not be fully acknowledged without destabilizing the order that followed. In later religious traditions, similar patterns emerge. Apocryphal texts circulate at the margins, offering alternative versions of origin stories only to be excluded from canon. These texts often contain more explicit conflict, more ambiguity, more questions than answers. Their exclusion is justified on theological grounds, but the effect is consistent. Complexity is reduced. Canon formation is often presented as a process of clarification. In practice, it is a process of narrowing. It selects for coherence, continuity, and control. And what does not fit is not necessarily false, but inconvenient. The War of the Gods, remembered too clearly, would be profoundly inconvenient. This pattern extends beyond religion into historiography itself. Official chronicles prioritize lineage, legitimacy, and succession. Moments of rupture are framed as anomalies or external invasions rather than internal collapse. History, like myth, becomes a tool for maintaining confidence in the present. Yet confidence built on omission is fragile. It requires constant reinforcement. It demands repetition of sanctioned narratives and discouragement of alternative interpretations. Over time, this creates an atmosphere where questioning feels transgressive, even when no explicit prohibition exists. The endurance of suppressed fragments suggests that complete erasure was never achieved. Something always slipped through. A line copied too faithfully. A symbol preserved without explanation. A ritual whose original meaning no longer aligns with official doctrine. These remnants act as pressure points, hinting at a deeper narrative beneath the surface. The modern impulse to reconstruct lost texts reflects a desire not only for knowledge, but for continuity. To bridge the gap between what was experienced and what was remembered. Yet reconstruction has limits. Without context, fragments remain ambiguous. They can be assembled in multiple ways, none definitive. This ambiguity may be the final safeguard left by those who shaped the record. By ensuring that no single reconstruction could fully restore the original narrative, they prevented any future generation from reclaiming the memory intact. The war, if remembered at all, would remain diffuse, interpretable, safely distant. What remains is not ignorance, but constraint. A sense that certain thresholds of understanding were deliberately not crossed, that the past was not simply lost, but managed. If the first War of the Gods marked a turning point in reality itself, then its most enduring legacy may be the architecture of forgetting that followed, a forgetting sophisticated enough to preserve function while dissolving origin. And perhaps that architecture still stands, not as a conspiracy, but as an inherited instinct. The instinct to prioritize coherence over completeness, stability over truth, survival over remembrance. The fragments remain where they are, scattered and resistant. They do not demand belief, they demand patience, and perhaps caution. Because to restore what was set aside may require confronting not only ancient conflict, but the reasons it was hidden in the first place. There is a moment when attention shifts upward, not toward belief, but toward orientation. Long before telescopes or equations, the sky functioned as both clock and archive. It regulated seasons, marked time, and imposed rhythm on human life. Yet in many early traditions, the sky is remembered not only as guide, but as witness. Something happened there, or through it, and its memory lingers in the way ancient cultures watched the heavens with a mixture of reverence and caution. In the tablets, celestial phenomena are rarely neutral. Stars are assigned roles. Planets are named after gods, not because they resemble them, but because they participate in governance. Their movements are read as decisions, warnings, confirmations. The sky is not distant, it is engaged, it responds, it intervenes, or appears to. What is striking is how often periods of instability on Earth are mirrored by descriptions of disturbance in the heavens. Omens multiply. Celestial alignments are interpreted as signs of displeasure or transition. The sky becomes a surface upon which tension is projected, or perhaps remembered, a place where the consequences of unseen conflict are made visible. Ancient astronomical records reveal a fascination with irregularity. Eclipses provoke anxiety. Comets inspire dread. Sudden appearances disrupt expectation. These events are not absorbed calmly. They are framed as disruptions to order, requiring interpretation and appeasement. The heavens, like the divine hierarchy, are expected to behave predictably. When they do not, something feels wrong. Some scholars argue that this sensitivity reflects an early scientific impulse, a desire to understand natural cycles. Yet the emotional weight attached to celestial disruption suggests something more. Fear, after all, is rarely attached to curiosity alone. It arises when unpredictability carries memory. In several traditions, the War of the Gods is associated not with land or sea, but with the sky itself. Battles are fought above. Victories are sealed through control of celestial domains. Authority over heaven becomes synonymous with authority over fate. This association implies that the conflict was not merely symbolic. It was spatial. It involved orientation, not just narrative. The sky also functions as boundary. What lies above is inaccessible, untouchable, beyond correction. To locate conflict, there is to place it beyond human intervention. The war becomes something that happened, but cannot be revisited. Its consequences descend. Its causes remain out of reach. This distancing may have been intentional. By relocating the memory of conflict to the heavens, ancient cultures preserved it without allowing it to destabilize earthly order. The sky could hold what the ground could not. It could remember without demanding response. Yet memory seeps downward. Ritual calendars align with celestial cycles. Festivals commemorate events whose origins are unclear, yet whose timing remains fixed. The repetition itself becomes the message. Something happened then. Something changes now. The connection persists even when explanation fades. The development of early astronomy is often celebrated as a triumph of rationality over myth, but the boundary is porous. Early astronomers were also priests, interpreters of signs rather than neutral observers. Their calculations did not replace meaning, they refined it. Precision became a way to manage uncertainty, not eliminate it. If the first war of the gods involved forces that altered the sky's behaviour, even temporarily, the impact on early human perception would have been profound. A sky that no longer behaved as expected would undermine the most basic assumptions about time, season, and survival. Such disruption would not be forgotten easily. It would be ritualized. There are hypotheses cautiously explored, suggesting that changes in Earth's orientation, atmospheric composition, or orbital behaviour could have been perceptible to early observers. Even subtle shifts, magnified through lived experience, could acquire mythic significance. The sky would become a reminder of vulnerability, not permanence. In this context, the insistence on reading meaning into celestial motion becomes understandable. If the sky once changed without warning, then watching it closely becomes a form of defense. Prediction becomes protection. Knowledge becomes survival. This vigilance persists long after the original threat has passed. The sky remains charged with expectation. Even in later traditions, signs from above retain disproportionate weight. Divine will is still sought in stars, even when theology insists on divine transcendence. Old habits endure. The war of the gods, relocated to the heavens, thus becomes both distant and ever-present. It is no longer an event, but a condition. A reminder that order can be disrupted from above, without consent or explanation. That stability depends on forces beyond immediate control. Modern astronomy has stripped the sky of intention, but not of impact. We know more, yet the unease remains. Objects still cross the heavens unexpectedly. Light still arrives from distances that defy comprehension. The sky is quieter now, but not less powerful. If ancient people encoded their deepest fears and memories into the stars, then those patterns remain, even if their meanings have shifted. The sky still holds the residue of questions that were never fully answered. It still invites interpretation, even when belief has faded. The tablets and the stars speak different languages, but they share a tone. Restraint, distance, endurance. They do not explain. They persist. They offer orientation without resolution. Perhaps the first war of the gods did not end in the heavens, but was placed there deliberately. A way to ensure that its memory would remain visible, yet unreachable. A warning written across the sky, softened by time, waiting for those who look long enough to sense that something once moved there with intention. Whether that intention belonged to gods, forces, or systems beyond current understanding remains unresolved. The sky does not clarify, it only continues, tracing patterns that feel older than explanation. And in those patterns the memory of conflict remains suspended, not forgotten, but held at a distance, waiting perhaps for a moment when looking upward feels less like habit and more like recognition. When the focus returns from the heavens to the human world, a quieter question begins to take shape, not about gods or skies, but about position. Where exactly did humanity stand while these structures were shifting? The tablets rarely place humans at the centre of divine conflict. Instead, they appear at the edges, created, instructed, warned, spared. Observers rather than participants. Yet this marginal placement may itself be a clue. In the earliest accounts, humans are described as labourers, caretakers, record keepers. They are given tasks, not choices. Their value lies in continuity, in maintaining rhythms disrupted elsewhere. Agriculture resumes, temples are rebuilt, offerings are made on schedule. Humanity becomes the stabilising element in a world that has recently known instability. This framing is revealing. It suggests that humans were not the cause of the rupture, nor its primary target. They were the medium through which recovery was enacted. A population capable of ritual, memory, and obedience could help re-anchor reality after disruption. Humanity, in this sense, was not elevated by the War of the Gods. It was assigned. Assignment carries weight. It implies intention. The gods, whatever they represent, are portrayed as deciding how much autonomy humans should possess. Knowledge is distributed selectively. Certain arts are taught, others are withheld, lifespans shorten, direct access diminishes. The relationship becomes asymmetrical but stable. This stability comes at a cost. Humans inherit a world already constrained, already shaped by decisions they did not make. Their myths begin not with creation from nothing, but with arrangement, with division, with allocation. Humanity enters a system midstream, adapting to rules whose origins are obscured. Some traditions preserve faint memories of an earlier closeness, a time when communication with the divine was less mediated, when boundaries were thinner. These memories are often framed as dangerous or forbidden. Curiosity leads to punishment. Overstepping leads to exile. The message is consistent. Distance is safety. This distance may have been necessary. If the War of the Gods represented a failure of coordination at a higher level, then limiting interaction with that level could reduce risk. Humanity becomes buffered, insulated by layers of ritual and institution. Direct knowledge is replaced by tradition, immediate presence by representation, yet even insulation leaves residue. Humans continue to feel the weight of decisions made elsewhere. Fate, destiny, decree. These concepts dominate early thought. Choice exists, but within narrow corridors. The future feels determined, not open. Agency is exercised through compliance rather than innovation. This worldview persists long after the gods retreat into abstraction. Even as societies grow more complex, the sense of inherited limitation remains. Progress is permitted, but only within bounds. Transgression is framed as hubris. The past looms as cautionary tale rather than inspiration. The War of the Gods, then, reshapes not only cosmology but psychology. Humanity learns restraint before it learns ambition. Survival depends on alignment rather than exploration. The unknown is treated with suspicion, not curiosity. Knowledge becomes something to be earned, not assumed. This may explain the peculiar humility embedded in early civilizations. Despite impressive achievements, they rarely claim mastery over the world. Instead, they emphasize dependence on cycles, on favor, on forces beyond control. Confidence is tempered by deference. Modern interpretations often read this humility as superstition, yet it may reflect lived experience. A memory, however dim, that the world can change abruptly, without consultation. That higher-level failures can cascade downward, reshaping existence for those least responsible. If humanity emerged from such a cascade, then caution becomes rational, memory becomes selective, progress becomes incremental. The cost of overreach is too high to ignore, even when its details have faded. There is also the matter of responsibility. By placing humans at the margins of divine conflict, the texts absolve them of blame. The war is not humanity's fault. The reset is not punishment for human failure. This distinction matters. It preserves the possibility of innocence, even within limitation. At the same time, it imposes obligation. Humanity must maintain what remains. The world is fragile. Order is borrowed. Ritual becomes maintenance rather than worship. Memory becomes duty rather than curiosity. This duty persists in subtle ways. Even now, long after belief in gods has waned, humanity remains preoccupied with preservation. Archives, laws, institutions, systems designed to outlast individuals. The instinct to stabilize endures. perhaps inherited from a time when instability nearly erased everything. If the first War of the Gods taught anything, it may have taught that continuity is precious and that memory must sometimes be managed to protect it. Humanity became the custodian of a world shaped by others, tasked with keeping it functional without fully understanding its origins. This custodianship is uneasy. It carries a sense of incompleteness, a feeling that something fundamental is missing, but missing for a reason. That curiosity must be balanced against caution, lest the conditions that required forgetting return. And yet, forgetting is never total. Questions resurface, patterns reappear. Humanity, positioned at the threshold between memory and ignorance, continues to look backward even as it moves forward. The War of the Gods recedes further into abstraction, but its shadow remains. It falls across human history as a quiet constraint, shaping not what is known, but what feels safe to know. Whether humanity was protected by this arrangement or limited by it remains unresolved. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps protection and limitation are indistinguishable at a certain scale. What is clear is that humanity did not inherit a blank world. It inherited an aftermath, and within that aftermath, it learned how to live carefully, building meaning from fragments and stability from silence. As the distance between event and memory grows, interpretation becomes inevitable. Where direct knowledge is absent, explanation rushes in. Over centuries, scholars, priests, and philosophers begin to circle the same fragments, each attempting to resolve the tension left behind by incomplete inheritance. The War of the Gods, no longer remembered as experience, becomes a problem of interpretation. This is where debate begins to harden, not between believers and skeptics, but between different ways of protecting coherence. Some argue that the fragments are purely symbolic, reflections of internal human struggles projected outward. Others insist that symbolism itself implies an origin, something concrete enough to require translation. The disagreement is rarely about evidence. It is about tolerance for uncertainty. Academic discourse often treats controversial interpretations as distractions, threats to methodological rigor. Yet controversy persists precisely because the material refuses to settle. The tablets do not behave like myths invented for entertainment. They behave like records that have been filtered, rearranged and constrained. Their restraint provokes suspicion, not dismissal. In various periods, alternative interpretations surface briefly, only to be sidelined. They suggest that the gods represent lost elites, advanced cultures, or intelligences no longer present. These suggestions are rarely disproven conclusively. They are simply labelled premature, speculative, or unfalsifiable. The conversation moves on, leaving the underlying questions intact. This pattern mirrors earlier institutional responses. Rather than confront destabilizing possibilities directly, systems prefer containment. Debate is allowed, but only within bounds. Certain questions are permitted. Others are discouraged by tone rather than prohibition. The effect is subtle but effective. Curiosity learns where it is welcome. What is striking is how often these discouraged questions align with moments of structural vulnerability. Periods of social upheaval tend to coincide with renewed interest in alternative histories. When present systems strain, the past becomes fluid again. Forgotten narratives resurface, offering different explanations for origin and authority. The War of the Gods becomes particularly relevant during such times. It offers a precedent for collapse and reorganization that does not center human failure. It suggests that systems can break from forces beyond their control. This idea can be comforting, but also dangerous. It shifts responsibility outward. Because of this, interpretations that emphasize non-human agency often encounter resistance. They complicate narratives of progress, autonomy, and mastery. They suggest that history is not solely human-made, that influence flows across scales not easily contained within academic categories. Even within mainstream scholarship, there is recognition that early history contains anomalies, sudden advances, abrupt transitions, knowledge appearing without clear lineage. These anomalies are often explained as convergence or coincidence, yet coincidence becomes less convincing when it repeats. The reluctance to engage fully with these anomalies may stem from the fear of reopening questions that have no clear resolution. If the War of the Gods cannot be definitively categorized as myth or history, then it occupies an uncomfortable middle ground, a space where certainty dissolves. Philosophy has long grappled with such spaces. Plato warned of myths that contain truth beyond literal fact. Later thinkers dismissed myth as primitive misunderstanding. Modern perspectives oscillate between these positions, unsure which offers greater stability. The persistence of contested interpretations suggests that the issue is not lack of data, but excess of implication. Accepting that early history may involve forces or actors beyond current frameworks would require rethinking foundational assumptions, not just about the past, but about humanity's place within larger systems. This is not an argument for any single alternative theory. It is an observation about resistance, about how certain questions trigger defensive responses regardless of their content. The War of the Gods, precisely because it resists closure, continues to provoke such responses. Over time, the debate itself becomes part of the legacy. Each generation inherits not only the fragments, but the arguments surrounding them. These arguments shape interpretation as much as evidence does. They define what feels reasonable, what feels excessive, what feels unsafe. In this way, the war continues, not in the heavens, but in discourse. Competing interpretations vie for legitimacy. Authority is negotiated, boundaries are drawn and redrawn. The conflict transforms into conversation, but the underlying tension remains. Perhaps this is inevitable. Perhaps any memory powerful enough to reshape reality cannot be fully resolved without losing its power. The War of the Gods survives precisely because it is unfinished, because it cannot be neatly absorbed into history or dismissed as fiction. What remains is a sense of caution embedded within inquiry itself, a hesitation to push too far, to connect too many dots, to allow speculation to outrun structure. This hesitation echoes earlier instincts to manage memory for the sake of stability. Yet stability is never permanent. As knowledge expands, old constraints loosen. New tools allow old questions to be asked differently. The fragments do not change, but our relationship to them does. The War of the Gods, refracted through centuries of interpretation, becomes less about what happened and more about how societies handle the unknown, whether they allow ambiguity to exist or attempt to resolve it prematurely. In the end, interpretation may be the final battlefield, not between gods, but between ways of knowing, between the desire for closure and the acceptance of uncertainty, between the impulse to explain and the willingness to listen. And perhaps the most faithful response to the fragments is not to force them into coherence, but to acknowledge their resistance, to accept that some aspects of origin may remain inaccessible, not because they're meaningless, but because they carry consequences still unfolding. If the first War of the Gods reshaped reality, then its echoes and interpretation are not errors, they are continuations, signs that the questions it raised were never meant to be settled easily. The debate persists because the past is not finished speaking, and because, in subtle ways, the structures it created continue to shape the limits of what can be comfortably known. As the debate stretches forward into the present, a subtle shift occurs. The questions do not disappear, but the tools used to approach them change. Where interpretation once relied on tradition and philosophy, it now turns toward measurement, simulation, and reconstruction. The past is no longer only read, it is modelled, recreated in fragments through data, probability, and inference. And in this process, the War of the Gods acquires a new kind of presence. Modern science does not seek gods, it seeks patterns. Yet patterns, once identified, carry implications regardless of the language used to describe them. Sudden transitions in climate, unexplained accelerations in cultural development, synchronized mythic motifs across distant regions. These are no longer curiosities, they are datasets, and datasets resist dismissal when they align too closely. Technologies that did not exist even a century ago now allow glimpses into moments once thought irretrievable. Ice cores preserve atmospheric memory. Sediment layers record catastrophe with chemical precision. Ancient DNA traces population bottlenecks invisible to written history. Each discovery narrows uncertainty while expanding implication. What emerges is not confirmation of myth, but discomfort with simplification. The Earth's recent past appears more volatile than once assumed. Human history appears less linear, more punctuated. Civilization does not rise smoothly. It stumbles, pauses, reconfigures. These patterns echo the ancient intuition of reset, now reframed without gods, but no less unsettling. At the same time, advances in theoretical physics complicate the notion of reality itself. The universe reveals itself as layered, probabilistic, dependent on conditions rather than absolutes. Causality bends, time behaves strangely. Observation alters outcome. These discoveries do not validate ancient narratives, but they destabilize confidence in rigid materialism. When reality itself becomes less intuitive, the distance between mythic language and scientific description narrows. Not because myths were correct in detail, but because they addressed instability as a lived condition rather than an abstract problem. They acknowledged rupture without explanation. Science now encounters similar limits, albeit through different methods. In this context, the War of the Gods can be re-examined without committing to literal belief. It can be approached as an early attempt to describe systemic failure at a scale beyond human control, a failure that required reorganization rather than repair, a collapse that could not be reversed, only managed. Modern systems theory speaks of phase transitions, tipping points, cascading failures. When thresholds are crossed, systems reorganize spontaneously into new configurations. These transitions are neither moral nor intentional, yet they feel decisive. After them, the system behaves differently. Memory of the previous state exists only as reference, not as possibility. This language aligns unexpectedly well with ancient narratives of cosmic reordering. The gods deliberate. Decrees are issued. The world changes. The story compresses complexity into agency, but the underlying intuition is familiar. Something broke beyond repair, and adaptation followed. The discomfort arises when these parallels suggest continuity rather than coincidence. When ancient memory appears less naive and more perceptive. When symbolic narratives seem to preserve insight rather than fantasy. This does not require gods to be real. It requires the past to be attentive. There is resistance to this idea, not because it is disproven, but because it blurs categories carefully maintained. Science prefers separation from a myth. History prefers human-centered causality. To admit that ancient frameworks may encode systemic understanding challenges modern hierarchies of knowledge. Yet challenge does not equal collapse. It invites humility. The recognition that earlier cultures, confronting forces they could not quantify, developed languages of meaning rather than measurement. Their narratives carried truth differently, prioritizing survival over precision. In this light, the War of the Gods becomes less about belief and more about memory strategy, a way to remember instability without reliving it, a way to encode warning without paralysis. Modern science, in its own way, attempts the same, modelling risk without succumbing to it. What differs is orientation. Ancient narratives place responsibility above humanity. Modern narratives place it within systems. Both approaches acknowledge limitation. Both accept that control is partial at best. As these perspectives converge, the question shifts again. Not whether the war happened, but whether humanity has faced similar thresholds before. Whether our current moment resembles past transitions remembered only through distortion. Whether the same instinct to manage memory is emerging once more. There is an unease in contemporary discourse, a sense that foundational systems, ecological, technological, social, are straining. Language of collapse returns, of reset, of thresholds crossed. The old vocabulary resurfaces, stripped of gods but heavy with implication. In this recurrence, the ancient fragments feel less distant, not because they predict the present, but because they resonate with it. They speak to the experience of living within systems that exceed comprehension, where consequences unfold faster than understanding. The war of the gods, reframed through modern lenses, becomes a mirror rather than a mystery. It reflects humanity's recurring encounter with scale, with complexity that resists mastery, with change that demands adaptation rather than explanation. This reflection is uncomfortable. It suggests that progress does not exempt us from cycles, that knowledge does not guarantee control. That memory, however refined, remains selective. Perhaps this is why the fragments endure. Not to instruct, but to caution. Not to reveal origins, but to remind us that origins may involve conditions no longer accessible and outcomes no longer reversible. As the present presses forward, the past watches quietly. Its stories remain unresolved, not because they are incomplete, but because they are still relevant. They describe a pattern humanity continues to trace, whether consciously or not. If the first war of the gods was a metaphor for systemic rupture, then its endurance suggests that rupture is not an anomaly. It is a feature of complex reality, and the question is not how to avoid it entirely, but how to carry memory through it without losing coherence. The ancient storytellers chose gods. We choose models and data. Both choices reveal the same concern: how to live responsibly within forces that do not ask permission. And perhaps that is the deepest continuity of all. Not belief, but caution. Not certainty, but awareness. A quiet understanding that stability once achieved must never be mistaken for permanence. At the far edge of the story, where fragments thin and certainty dissolves, what remains is not an answer but a posture, a way of standing in relation to what cannot be fully recovered. The tablets do not conclude, the myths do not resolve. Even the modern models, precise and persuasive, taper into probabilities rather than declarations. The first war of the gods recedes into this shared horizon, less an event than a condition that shaped how remembering itself would function. If there was a conflict, it did not leave behind a monument. It left behind a method. Memory was folded inward, compacted, made survivable. The world that followed learned to value order over disclosure, continuity over confession. Stability became the highest virtue, not because it was perfect, but because it was fragile. Across time, this fragility taught restraint. It taught cultures to encode rather than explain, to symbolize rather than narrate. It taught institutions to curate origins, to offer beginnings that could be lived with. The cost of this restraint was incompleteness. The benefit was endurance. There is a quiet honesty in that trade. It acknowledges limits, not only of knowledge but of tolerance. Some truths, encountered too directly, do not clarify. They overwhelm. They fracture coherence. They demand response before understanding has time to form. In such cases, distance is not denial, it is protection. The War of the Gods, in this sense, may have been the first lesson in scale, a realization that forces exist which exceed narrative capacity. That reality can reorganize itself without regard for expectation. That adaptation, rather than mastery, is the more reliable response. This lesson persists, threaded through history like a subdued chord. It sounds whenever certainty hardens into dogma, whenever system mistakes stability for permanence, whenever memory is treated as inventory rather than inheritance, The fragments stir, not to accuse, but to caution. What is striking is how gently they do so. There is no insistence, no demand for belief, only repetition, only pattern. The same shapes reappear across languages and centuries, as if to say that the details matter less than the orientation. Look here. Notice this. Do not assume the present is immune to the past. In this way, the ancient material does not compete with modern understanding. It complements it. Where science quantifies risk, myth preserves intuition. Where data predicts thresholds, story remembers what it feels like when they are crossed. Both approaches recognize that continuity is achieved, not guaranteed. The temptation, especially at the end of inquiry, is to decide, to label the war as metaphor or memory or misinterpretation, to close the circle and move on. Yet closure may be the one thing the fragments consistently resist. They do not want to be finished with. They want to remain in view, unresolved, quietly shaping how beginnings are imagined. Perhaps this resistance is itself the message, that the past should not be consumed for certainty but consulted for perspective, that some events are too consequential to be domesticated by explanation. They must remain open, not to invite speculation, but to maintain humility. Humility, after all, is the common thread. The gods of the tablets are powerful, but not absolute. The institutions that followed are authoritative, but not omniscient. Modern systems are sophisticated, but not invulnerable. Each layer inherits the same condition, influence without total control. The war of the gods may mark the moment this condition was first recognized, when reality revealed itself as layered, contingent, capable of internal conflict, when order emerged not as a given, but as an outcome of negotiation, compromise and loss. If so, then humanity's role has always been to live within aftermaths, to build meaning atop structures shaped by forces that have already passed out of view, to maintain what works, while sensing that it could have been otherwise. This sensing is subtle. It appears as unease when narratives feel too complete, as curiosity when patterns repeat without explanation, as a quiet reluctance to accept that the world has only one story, told once and finished. In moments of stillness, this reluctance becomes audible. It hums beneath explanation, beneath belief, beneath skepticism. It does not ask to be resolved. It asks to be acknowledged. The tablets lie where they have always lain, unchanging. The sky traces its familiar paths. The ground holds its layers. Nothing announces itself. And yet the sense remains that something foundational once shifted, and that the way we remember beginnings was altered as a result. Whether the war was fought by gods, by systems, or by conditions that resist naming may never be known. What matters is the imprint it left on memory itself, a memory cautious enough to survive, ambiguous enough to endure, incomplete enough to remain alive. As the inquiry reaches its natural pause, there is no conclusion to offer, only an image of clay pressed by hands that understood restraint, of stories told softly to avoid waking what they remembered, of knowledge carried forward not as possession, but as responsibility. The first war of the gods, if it existed, did not end with victory. It ended with silence shaped carefully enough to hold a world together. And perhaps that silence is not empty. Perhaps it is the space where awareness begins, not as certainty, not as fear, but as the quiet recognition that reality has passed through thresholds before and may do so again. That memory, even when fragmented, can still guide without revealing everything it knows. In that recognition, the fragments rest. They do not demand interpretation. They simply remain, inviting patience, waiting for those moments when listening feels safer than concluding, and wondering feels more faithful than answering.